Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I'm going to be acting as your own personal, highly energetic teaching assistant today. We've put together a masterclass review session that is specifically designed to help you absolutely ace your upcoming biology exam on ecosystem dynamics. I know we've got a lot of ground to cover, but don't worry, we've organized it all into super clear, easy-to-digest concepts. So grab your notebooks and let's get into it.
Okay, let's quickly dive into this study roadmap so you know exactly what to expect. First up, ecosystem energetics and productivity. Then, we'll analyze ecological pyramids. Third, we'll break down the stages of ecological succession. And finally, we'll wrap up the whole shebang with series and climax communities.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Ecosystem Energetics and Productivity. Before we can look at the whole ecosystem, we really have to understand the foundational math of how energy enters an environment and exactly how it's accounted for.
Let's lock in some foundational vocabulary right out of the gate. You absolutely need to know these two terms for the exam. First, biomass. This is quite simply the total mass of the plants or animals in a particular place. Just think of a massive forest you love to hike in. That is just a huge physical accumulation of biomass. Productivity, then, is the rate at which that biomass increases per unit area over time. So when we talk about primary productivity, we're really talking about the generation of this biomass by producers, like plants capturing the sun's energy.
Now, exam questions love to test the difference between gross primary production, or GPP, and net primary production, NPP. The easiest way to remember this, think of it like a paycheck. GPP is your gross income, the absolute total amount of chemical energy the plant creates. But hey, plants have to live and breathe too, right? So NPP is your net income. It's the amount of chemical energy that actually remains as newly laid down biomass after the producer has burned up some of that energy for its own cellular respiration.
Let's treat the formula NPP equals GPP minus respiration as a super basic accounting principle. Let's walk through an example directly from our source material. Imagine a giant ackee tree in a yard. In a single day, it produces 3,245 kilojoules of energy. That right there is our GPP. But ecologists studying the metabolic functions of this tree found that it uses 700 kilojoules of energy just to keep itself alive. That's our respiration, or R.
You do the math and boom, 2,545 kilojoules. This final calculated answer for the ackee tree's NPP is a massive number to know because this is the exact amount of energy that actually becomes physical plant tissue. And why does that matter? Well, because this 2,545 kilojoules is the maximum energy that can logically be passed on to the next trophic level, if, say, a hungry herbivore comes along and takes a bite out of the tree.
Moving right along to Section 2, Analyzing Ecological Pyramids. Now that we have the micro-level energy calculations down, we're going to shift our focus to understanding macro-level ecosystem structures.
So, we visualize these macro structures using an ecological pyramid. It's basically a graph showing the relationship between different living organisms at different trophic levels, usually with the producers forming a nice, broad base. Now here is a massive pro tip for your exam. Be ready to name their limitations. They definitely oversimplify complex ecosystems, they only represent static moments in time rather than dynamic changes, and they really struggle to accurately place species that eat across multiple different trophic levels.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide, the pyramid of numbers, is how literal it is. To build this model, ecologists physically count the number of individual organisms at each level, starting from the massive base of producer plants at the bottom, moving up through the herbivores, and tapering off at the very top with a tiny number of apex predators, like, say, a single lion on the savanna.
Obviously, there are major pros and cons here. The great advantage is that it's fairly easy to just count things, and it is completely non-lethal to the animals, which is great. However, the huge disadvantage, it completely ignores the actual physical size of the organisms. A single giant oak tree and a single tiny blade of grass both just count as one producer. Because of this, pyramids of numbers can confusingly become inverted. Just imagine thousands of tiny parasitic insects feeding on one single large tree.
And speaking of inverted pyramids, pay close attention because this is a classic trap you will likely see on your exam. In a marine ecosystem, a pyramid of biomass is entirely upside down. I mean, how on earth can a tiny amount of producer phytoplankton support a huge mass of zooplankton? The answer is their incredibly high turnover rate. Phytoplankton reproduce super fast.
They're eaten constantly by primary consumers, which minimizes their standing biomass at any one exact moment. But that rapid reproduction is exactly why the oceans can ultimately support massive creatures like whales, from seemingly invisible producers.
Generally, pyramids of biomass solve the organism size issue we just talked about. But there's kind of a dark side to this data collection. For the data to be perfectly accurate, you have to measure dry biomass. If you just weigh organisms naturally, the varying amounts of water in their bodies make the numbers super unreliable. So measuring dry biomass unfortunately means that the plants and animals literally have to be killed and dehydrated to get an accurate reading.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is that this next type, the pyramid of energy, is the undisputed king of ecological models. Why? Because it is always upright. There are literally no inverted pyramids of energy anywhere in the world. And that's because the laws of thermodynamics strictly dictate that energy is always lost as heat at every single step up the trophic ladder. Because it takes into account the rate of production over time, it super accurately shows the efficiency of energy conversion. It's the most consistent model we have, allowing ecologists to compare totally different ecosystems side by side. The major disadvantage, though, collecting this kind of highly detailed energetic data over time is incredibly complex, time-consuming, and just straight-up difficult to pull off in the field.
All right, let's shift gears to Section 3, Ecological Succession. Now that we know how energy and mass stack up, we really need to look at how environments structurally change over long periods of time.
Succession kicks off with pioneer species. I literally want you to think of them as the microscopic real estate developers of the ecosystem. They are the absolute first species to arrive on completely inhospitable terrain, and they do the grueling, heavy-lifting foundation work that makes the environment livable for everything else that's going to follow over the coming centuries. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what they do. Notice how lichens and drought-resistant mosses will literally colonize solid, bare rock. They physically attach to the surface, secrete these mild acids to slowly fragment and break it down, and trap wind-blown debris. Then, when they die, their organic waste adds to this mix, literally building the very first incredibly thin layer of actual soil from nothing but solid stone. It's wild.
Okay, make sure you memorize this explicit distinction for your test. Primary succession is what we just looked at. It starts from absolute scratch, in totally lifeless areas with no soil, like newly cooled volcanic lava or a retreating glacier. It is agonizingly slow. Secondary succession, however, happens when an ecosystem gets disturbed, like by a massive forest fire or abandoned farming, but the soil remains intact. Because the soil and some seeds are already hanging out there, secondary succession bounces back much, much faster.
Which brings us to our final module, Section 4. Series and climax communities. We've seen the physical stages of succession, but ecologists have specific terminology to categorize these sequences. Let's make sure you have the vocabulary down cold. The big overarching term you need is SEER. A SEER is the entire complete sequence of developmental stages of biotic succession, all the way from the arrival of the very first pioneer species right up to the final mature community. Within that massive sequence, each individual community stage that temporarily dominates and then changes is simply called a seral stage.
Now, different starting environments have different names for their series. Seriously, get your screenshot button ready right now because this table is basically a cheat sheet for the exam. If succession starts in water, it's a hydroseer. On bare rock, a lithoseer. If it begins on coastal sand, it's a samoseer. In a salty, saline environment like a marsh, it's a haloseer. And if it starts in an extremely dry, water-limited area like a desert, you guessed it, it's a xeroseer.
Regardless of whether it's a hydroseer or a xeroseer, if you leave it completely undisturbed for a long enough time, succession eventually stabilizes. This final stage is called the climax community. It represents a mature, beautifully balanced ecosystem where species populations remain stable over long periods. This is the absolute end game of ecological development. And when a climax community is extensive and well-defined across a massive geographic area, we call it a biome, which is what gives us things like the vast tundra or the sprawling tropical rainforests. But we don't live in a world without human interference. So to wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with this question. What happens when human interference actively prevents an ecosystem from ever reaching that final climax community? Things like continuous agriculture, controlled burning, or deforestation act as arresting factors. They artificially freeze the ecosystem in an earlier stage, creating what is known as a plagioclimax community. It's a pretty powerful reminder that our actions don't just change nature in the moment, they permanently alter its developmental timeline. So what plagioclimax communities might exist right in your own backyard? Good luck on your biology exam. Keep reviewing these concepts, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.